The millionaire husband humiliated his sick wife. "You are useless." However, what happened made him fall to his knees and beg for forgiveness. The sun cast golden rays over the Donovan estate, illuminating the sleek modern mansion that stood as a symbol of success and power. Inside, everything was pristine. Marble floors gleamed under the chandeliers, art pieces curated from around the world lined the walls, and the scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. It was the kind of home that made people envious, the kind that whispered wealth and influence. Michael Donovan stood in his vast office, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit. He was a man who had built himself from nothing, clawing his way to the top of the construction industry, to the outside world. He was the embodiment of achievement, a sharp mind, an iron will, and a bank account that could buy anything he desired. And yet, something had begun to crack beneath the surface. Emily, his wife of 15 years, had always been his most loyal supporter. She had been there when he was just a struggling entrepreneur, sharing in his dreams, lifting him up when he doubted himself. But now she was different lately. She had become weak. She moved slower, often pausing to catch her breath after climbing the stairs. Her once bright energy had dimmed, and dark circles had taken residence under her eyes. At first, Michael ignored it. He was too busy, too focused on expansion, on deals, on growing their wealth. But as the days passed, her condition worsened. "Are you okay?" he had asked one evening, his tone neutral, his eyes barely leaving his phone. "I don't know," Emily had admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been feeling so tired lately. My muscles ache and sometimes I get dizzy just standing up." He sighed, rubbing his temple. "Then go to a doctor, get it checked out." "I will," she said. I need some rest." And she did. But rest didn't seem to help. The spark that once made Emily so radiant was fading. And Michael found himself growing irritated. One evening, as they sat at the dinner table, Emily struggled to lift her fork. Her hand trembled slightly, her grip unsteady. She managed to take a bite, but not before her fork clattered against her plate. The sound was small, insignificant, but to Michael, it was unbearable. "For God's sake, Emily," he snapped, setting his glass down with force. "Can you at least try not to be so helpless?" Her eyes widened, wounded. You used to be strong," he interrupted, pushing his plate away. "Now you act like some fragile, sickly thing. It's exhausting." Silence hung between them, thick and suffocating. Emily swallowed hard, blinking back tears. "I don't want to be like this, Michael. I don't know what's wrong with me." He exhaled sharply, standing. "Then fix it. You're not the woman I married." He left before she could respond, his irritation simmering beneath his skin. That night, Emily lay awake in bed staring at the ceiling. She had always believed in their marriage, in the strength of their bond. She had stood by Michael when times were hard, when investors pulled out, when bills piled up. She had believed in him when no one else did. But now, as she listened to his steady breathing beside her, she realized something unsettling. Michael didn't believe in her anymore. The following weeks brought more of the same. Emily's symptoms persisted, and with them, Michael's patience wore thinner. At first, he tried to ignore it, burying himself in work, in meetings, in the thrill of new deals. But every time he came home, he was confronted with the same thing. A wife who seemed to be deteriorating before his eyes. One afternoon she collapsed in the hallway, her legs giving out beneath her. Rachel, her best friend, was visiting and rushed to her side. "Emily!" Rachel gasped, helping her up. "What happened?" I don't know," Emily murmured, her breath ragged. "I just felt so weak all of a sudden." Rachel turned to Michael, who stood at the top of the stairs, watching with a blank expression. "She needs help, Michael," Rachel said, her voice edged with frustration. "She's not okay." Michael crossed his arms. "She says she's fine." Rachel's eyes narrowed. "And you believe that?" He said nothing. Rachel clenched her jaw and turned back to Emily. "You're coming with me." Emily hesitated, glancing up at her husband. "Michael." His response was cold. "Do whatever you want." And so she did. Rachel took Emily that evening to a specialized clinic, where doctors would run tests, where she could get the care she needed. Michael didn't stop her. He didn't ask where they were going or when she'd be back. He simply watched as she walked out of their home, as if she were nothing more than an afterthought, as if she had never meant anything at all, and for the first time in years, Emily felt something unfamiliar. Relief, Michael, however, saw it differently. As the door shut behind them, he exhaled, shaking his head. Finally, no more dealing with fragile emotions, no more walking on eggshells, no more feeling tied down to something that drained him. He was free, at least. That's what he told himself. As he poured himself a glass of whiskey and stepped out onto the balcony, he looked out at the city skyline, bathed in the glow of the evening lights. Somewhere deep inside, a whisper of something, regret, doubt, threatened to surface. But Michael crushed it before it could take root. Tomorrow he had deals to make, investors to meet, a life to live. Emily was no longer his problem. Michael Donovan barely noticed Emily's absence in the first few days. Without her slow, fragile presence around the house, life felt easier. He no longer had to listen to her struggling to get up from the couch or see the look of helplessness in her eyes. The mansion felt lighter, as if it had been relieved of an invisible weight. And so he threw himself into his work. Deals needed closing. Clients needed schmoozing. Michael was in his element, working late hours, attending exclusive business dinners, surrounding himself with people who only spoke about success. Emily had become a distant thought, until Rachel called. "You didn't even ask how she's doing." Rachel's voice was sharp, brimming with resentment. Michael, sitting in his high-rise office, sighed and leaned back in his leather chair. "I assume she's fine. She's getting the help she needs, isn't she?" Rachel's scoff was audible. "So you're unbelievable. Emily was breaking, Michael, and you just let her go." Michael rubbed his temple. "She wanted to go. I didn't stop her." "She begged for your support," Rachel hissed. "She just needed you to stand by her." Michael's jaw tightened. He wasn't in the mood for a lecture. "Rachel, I'm busy if there's nothing else." "She doesn't ask about you, you know," Rachel interrupted. "Not once. I thought you should know that." And then the line went dead. Michael stared at his phone, his fingers gripping it just a little tighter than before. It shouldn't bother him. It didn't bother him. Days turned into weeks, and Michael embraced his newfound freedom. Business trips, high-profile events, evenings filled with expensive wine and flirtatious company. It was the life he had always envisioned for himself. And yet, the whispers had started. "You heard about Donovan's wife," someone murmured at a gala dinner one evening. "They practically abandoned her," another voice answered. "She was sick and he just left." Michael clenched his jaw, gripping his glass of whiskey a little too tightly. It didn't matter what people thought, let them talk. He had money, he had power, he was untouchable. But the unease in his chest lingered. Then, the cracks began to show. Michael's company had always been built on confidence. His investors, his partners, his clients, all believed in him because he made them believe. He was a man who could close any deal, seal any contract, make things happen. But now there were doubts. His latest project. His latest? A multi-million-dollar construction deal in downtown Chicago stalled. A key investor pulled out, citing personal concerns but refusing to elaborate. Another partner hesitated to sign off on a major expansion. "Michael, people are starting to question your judgment," his lawyer Alan said over dinner one evening. "The rumors aren't helping." Michael frowned. "Rumors," Alan sighed, "that you abandoned your wife the moment she became inconvenient." Michael exhaled, shaking his head. "That's ridiculous." Alan leaned in, lowering his voice. "Is it?" For the first time, Michael felt something unsettling creep in, the realization that his actions had consequences. He brushed it off. People had short memories. In a few months, no one would care. But as he left the restaurant that night, the weight of Rachel's words echoed in his mind. "She doesn't ask about you. Not once." The final blow came a few weeks later. Michael had just returned from a weekend retreat in Aspen when he found an envelope waiting for him in his office. Inside, a single sheet of paper, a divorce petition. Michael stared at the document, his mind blank. He read the words over and over again, trying to make sense of them. Emily was divorcing him. The woman who had stood by him through everything. The woman who had been his anchor when he was just starting out. The woman he had taken for granted. She was leaving him for good. His chest tightened, but not out of love. Not exactly. It was the realization that he was the one being discarded now. He had expected Emily to wait, to linger in the shadows, hoping he would come back. He had assumed she would always be there, no matter what. But she was walking away. For the first time in his life, Michael Donovan felt powerless. Michael sat in his office, staring at the divorce petition as if it were written in another language. The words blurred together, twisting into something incomprehensible. His grip on the paper tightened. Emily wanted to leave him. No, that didn't make sense. She had left, but not like this. Not legally, not permanently. He had assumed she needed time, that she would come back eventually, ready to talk, to reconcile, to fall back into the life they had built. He had never considered the possibility that she might be done for good. A slow, bitter laugh escaped his lips. He wasn't grieving their relationship, not in the way most men might. He wasn't sad or heartbroken. No. What gnawed at him was the sheer audacity of it all. Emily had left first, and yet she was the one ending it. A sharp knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. His assistant, Marissa, peeked in hesitantly. "Mr. Donovan, Alan is on line 1. He said it's important." Michael took a deep breath, smoothing out his expression before picking up the phone. "What's the damage?" he asked. Alan sighed on the other end. "Straight to the point, huh? Look, Michael, I'll be blunt, you can fight this, but I don't see the point. If Emily wants out, dragging this into court will only make you look worse." Michael clenched his jaw. "She's the one walking away. Why should I make it easy for her?" "Because you're already walking on thin ice," Alan replied. "Your investors are hesitant. And your reputation isn't exactly stellar right now. A messy divorce. It'll only fuel the fire." Michael leaned back in his chair, running a hand down his face. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He was supposed to be the one in control. "Fine," he said at last. "Send me the details, I'll look them over." "Smart move," Alan replied. "And Michael, don't take too long. Emily's not waiting around for you." Michael had never been one to drink excessively, but that night the bottle of scotch in his private bar seemed more appealing than ever. The mansion was too quiet without Emily. It wasn't something he had noticed before, not really. He had liked the silence, or so he had thought, but now as he walked through the vast, empty spaces, there was a hollowness that gnawed at him. Her presence had been woven into the fabric of this house, into the little things he had never paid attention to. The scent of her vanilla perfume still lingered in their bedroom. The book she had left unfinished still sat on the coffee table. The worn-out blanket she always curled up with on the couch was still draped over the armrest. For the first time, he let himself wonder, was she ever truly happy here? Had he even noticed? The last time she had smiled, the thought made his stomach twist. With a low growl, he poured himself another glass and knocked it back. Regret was useless. Emily had made her choice, and Michael, he would move on. He always did. A week passed, and Emily remained a ghost. Rachel had stopped calling. The divorce papers remained untouched, and Michael kept himself buried in work. Deals, meetings, acquisitions. It was all a distraction, a way to silence the noise in his head. But even distractions had their limits. One evening, as he sat in his office, the phone rang. His assistant's voice came through the intercom. "Sir, there's a call for you, a Mr. Callahan." Michael frowned. "Who?" "Dr. Callahan from Silver Oak Medical Center." Michael stiffened. Silver Oak, that was the clinic Rachel had taken Emily to. For a split second, something flickered inside him. Concern, maybe, but he quickly buried it under indifference. "Put him through." A moment later, a deep voice came over the line. "Mr. Donovan, this is Dr. Callahan. I'm calling regarding your wife." "Ex-wife," Michael corrected sharply. A pause. "Right, my apologies. I just wanted to inform you that Emily's condition has improved significantly since her arrival here." Michael's grip on the phone tightened. "Her condition, she never told you." "Did she?" Dr. Callahan continued, almost as if he were realizing it in real time. "Mr. Donovan, Emily came to us under the assumption that she was suffering from a progressive illness. However, after extensive testing, we determined that her initial diagnosis was incorrect. She..." Michael sat up straighter. "What are you saying?" "Emily isn't terminally ill, in fact. Her symptoms were due to a misdiagnosed autoimmune disorder, one that, with proper treatment, is completely manageable." The words crashed into him like a freight train. She wasn't dying. The illness that had made him resent her, that had made him push her away, wasn't even real. Dr. Callahan continued speaking, but Michael barely heard him. His mind reeled, flashing back to every cruel remark, every dismissive action, every moment he had refused to see her pain. "Mr. Donovan, are you still there?" Michael swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. "Yeah, I need to go." He ended the call without another word. Staring at his desk in stunned silence, for months, he had believed Emily was weak, a burden, someone who had lost her value because of an illness that had drained her of vitality. But the truth was simple, devastating. She could have been saved if he had just listened, if he had just cared, but instead, he had abandoned her, and now she was healing. Without him, Michael Donovan had always believed in control. He had built his empire with sheer will, never allowing emotions to interfere with logic. But as he sat in his dimly lit office, staring at the blank screen of his laptop, logic had abandoned him. The words from Dr. Callahan still echoed in his mind. Emily isn't terminally ill. A misdiagnosed autoimmune disorder, completely manageable. His chest tightened as he recalled how easily he had dismissed her suffering, how he had scorned her weakness, and now she was healing, living, moving on. Without him, Michael clenched his jaw and exhaled sharply. He needed a distraction, something, anything, to drown out the noise in his head, so he did what he always did. He returned to the world that had once embraced him, the world of high society, luxury, and excess. The club was packed, the air thick with the scent of expensive perfume and overpriced liquor. The bass thumped beneath his feet, a rhythmic pulse that matched the tension brewing inside him. Michael sat in a VIP booth, a crystal tumbler of whiskey in his hand, surrounded by laughter and flirtatious glances. Women leaned in close, their voices syrupy, their touches lingering. For years, this had been his playground. These people admired him, envied him. They laughed at his jokes, hung onto his words, and yet tonight it all felt hollow. Michael. A sultry voice purred in his ear. He turned to find Vanessa, a model he had entertained in the past. She slid into the seat beside him, her manicured fingers grazing his arm. "I haven't seen you in weeks. I thought you forgot about me." He smirked, the expression forced. "I've been busy," Vanessa pouted. "Too busy for fun." She trailed her fingers along his chest, but Michael barely felt it. His mind was elsewhere, on a quiet house, on a woman who used to wait for him, who had once believed in him. For the first time, the distraction didn't work. Vanessa leaned in closer, her lips grazing his jaw. "Come home with me." Michael's grip tightened around his glass. A month ago, he would have said yes without hesitation, but now he saw Emily in his mind, not the sickly, the tired version he had pushed away, but the woman she had been before, the one who had laughed at his terrible jokes, who had kissed him softly in the mornings, who had loved him before he turned into someone unrecognizable. And just like that, he felt sick. Michael downed his drink and stood abruptly. "Not tonight," Vanessa blinked in surprise. "Michael," but he was already walking away. By the time he returned home, the alcohol had done nothing to dull his thoughts. The mansion was dark and silent, but the emptiness was deafening. Every corner of the house whispered reminders of Emily, her soft laughter, the way she used to hum while making tea, the scent of her lingering in their bedroom. Michael poured himself another drink, but the burn in his throat wasn't enough to drown the guilt. "She needed you. You abandoned her. She's getting better without you." The thoughts gnawed at him, relentless. He had spent so much time chasing wealth, status, and power that he had forgotten what truly mattered. And now the only person who had ever loved him for him was gone. His phone buzzed on the counter, snapping him out of his thoughts. A message from Alan. "Alan, investors are pulling back from the Chicago deal. Call me first thing in the morning." Michael frowned. Investors pulling back, that was unusual. Before he could process it further, another notification lit up the screen. This time from a news site. Michael Donovan faces backlash amid divorce rumors. Investors concerned about stability of Donovan Enterprises. Michael's stomach sank. He clicked on the article, scanning the text quickly. It was brutal. Anonymous sources had spoken about his callous treatment of Emily, how he had abandoned her in a time of need. The piece painted him as a cold, ruthless man. And while that would have once been a badge of honor in the business world, it spelled disaster. Reputation was everything. He ran a hand down his face. He needed to get ahead of this damage control. But deep down, he knew. This wasn't just about the press. This was karma. For years, Michael had believed himself untouchable. Now he was learning just how quickly things could fall apart. He put his glass down and stared at his reflection in the dark window. For the first time in his life, Michael Donovan was losing, and the worst part, he had no one to blame but himself. Michael Donovan had built his business on confidence. He prided himself on knowing how to sell an image, how to make people believe in his vision. But as he sat in his office the next morning, scrolling through headline after headline, he realized something chilling. He was no longer in control of the narrative. The headlines were relentless. Donovan Enterprises facing uncertainty as CEO's divorce sparks controversy. Investors back away from Chicago deal amidst rumors of Michael Donovan's personal scandals. Abandoned wife, failed leadership, Michael Donovan's reputation in freefall. Michael slammed his laptop shut, the sound echoing through his office, his hands clenched into fists. This wasn't supposed to happen. His assistant, Marissa, knocked hesitantly before stepping inside. "Mr. Donovan, Alan is here to see you." Michael exhaled sharply. "Send him in." Alan walked in, looking every bit like a man who had been handling damage control all morning. His suit was slightly wrinkled, and there was a tense set to his jaw. "We need to talk," Alan said, taking a seat. "And you're not going to like what I have to say." Michael leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Then don't waste my time sugarcoating it," Alan sighed. "The Chicago deal is officially dead. Our investors pulled out, and without their backing, the entire project is unsustainable. That's a multi-million-dollar loss, Michael." Michael's chest tightened. "I'll find new investors." "It's not that simple," Alan continued. "Your reputation is toxic right now. No one wants to be associated with you, this divorce. The way the media is spinning it. It's making you look like a man who can't be trusted," Michael scoffed. "Since when does my personal life dictate my ability to run a business?" Alan shook his head. "Since people started seeing you as a liability. Investors don't like unpredictability, and right now you're a walking power disaster." Michael ran a hand through his hair, frustration boiling beneath the surface. "So what's the solution?" "You need to get ahead of this, show the world you're still in control. Make a statement, publicly acknowledge the divorce. Take some responsibility." Michael's expression darkened. "I'm not apologizing for anything," Alan sighed. "Then be prepared for more losses." Silence filled the office. Michael's empire was built on perception, and now that perception was turning against him. That evening he sat alone in his mansion, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his mind a storm of thoughts. The Chicago deal was dead. Investors were fleeing. His reputation was hanging by a thread, and for the first time, Michael Donovan had no idea how to fix it. His phone buzzed, breaking the silence. He glanced at the screen, Rachel. His grip tightened around the glass. He considered ignoring it. He wasn't in the mood for another lecture, but something in him, perhaps desperation, perhaps curiosity, made him answer. "What do you want?" he said, his voice edged with exhaustion. Rachel didn't hesitate. "Have you signed the divorce papers yet?" Michael exhaled through his nose. "Not yet." "Of course not," she muttered. "Let me guess, you thought she'd come back to you." Michael said nothing. Rachel's voice softened, but there was no sympathy in it. "She's not coming back, Michael. She's doing better without you." A bitter laugh escaped him. "Yeah, I got that memo." Rachel hesitated before speaking again. "I don't know if you even care, but she's happy now, she's healthier, she's moving on, you should do the same." Something in Michael twisted. "She was never supposed to leave like this," he admitted, surprising even himself. Rachel's voice hardened. "No, Michael, you were never supposed to push her away." The line went dead. Michael stared at his reflection in the dark window. For the first time in his life, he felt truly alone. And the worst part, he had done this to himself. Michael Donovan had always considered himself invincible. He had built an empire from nothing, turning a small construction firm into one of the most powerful real estate companies in the country. He had money, power, and influence. Everything a man could ever want, but none of it mattered now, not when he was losing everything. The morning started like any other. Michael waking up to an empty bed, an aching head from the previous night's whiskey, and an inbox full of problems. He had barely stepped into his office when Marissa, his assistant, rushed in, her face pale. "Mr. Donovan, it's urgent." Michael barely glanced at her, rubbing his temple. "Unless the building is on fire, it can wait." "It's not the building," she said, hesitating. "It's your health." Michael frowned. "What the hell are you talking about?" Marissa swallowed. "Dr. Callahan called. He said you missed your last 2 checkups. He also mentioned that you've been having symptoms." Michael clenched his jaw. "I'm fine." Marissa hesitated before stepping forward. "Sir, you've been forgetting things. You've been slurring your words sometimes, and last week you—" She stopped herself, lowering her voice. "You nearly collapsed in the boardroom." Michael's patience snapped. "Are you my assistant or my doctor?" Marissa took a deep breath. "Neither. But I am someone who's watched you destroy yourself these past few months." Michael's hands tightened into fists. "Get out!" She didn't argue. She simply left, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before. Hours later, Michael sat at his desk, scrolling mindlessly through financial reports that he could barely focus on. A headache pounded at his skull, his vision blurring slightly as he tried to concentrate. He needed to get it together. He needed to... A sharp pain shot through his head, followed by a sudden terrifying weakness in his right arm. His fingers fumbled against the edge of his desk as his body went limp. He tried to call for help, but his words slurred together, his tongue suddenly heavy. Something was wrong. Panic flooded his mind as his body betrayed him. He could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears, feel the sweat beading at his brow, then everything went dark. Michael awoke to the rhythmic beeping of hospital monitors. His body felt heavy, his limbs sluggish. It took him several moments to register where he was. His mouth was dry, his throat raw. But when he tried to speak, his voice came out garbled. A nurse appeared by his bedside, her expression professional but not unkind. "Mr. Donovan," she said gently, "you had a stroke." The words slammed into him like a freight train. A stroke. Michael blinked, his brain struggling to process. He was 46 years old. He exercised, he had regular health checkups. This wasn't supposed to happen. The nurse continued speaking. "The doctors were able to minimize the damage, but you'll need physical therapy. Your motor functions have been affected, particularly on your right side. We'll assess your speech in the coming days." Michael barely heard her. His mind was racing. A stroke for the first time in his life. He wasn't the one in control. His body had betrayed him. His empire was crumbling, and he had no one to lean on. The hospital stay felt like a slow descent into hell. The days blurred together, doctors running tests, nurses checking his vitals, physical therapists attempting to get him to move again. Every step, every movement was a struggle. The frustration burned inside him, white-hot and suffocating. No one from the company visited, no business partners, no friends, and Emily. She didn't come, not that he expected her to. Rachel had been right. Emily was happy, healing, living a life free from him. She had no reason to return. Michael was truly alone. 3 weeks later, he was discharged. His once confident stride had been reduced to a slow, awkward walk, his right side still weak. His speech was mostly intact, but sometimes words came out slower than they used to. The world that had once been his playground now felt foreign. His mansion was emptier than ever. His inbox overflowed with messages, but none were from people who truly mattered. His company had survived his absence, but barely. Sitting in his vast, quiet living room, Michael finally understood. This was his reckoning. The man who had called his wife a burden was now a burden himself. He had thrown Emily away when she needed him, and now, when he needed someone, anyone, there was no one left to catch him. The silence in Michael Donovan's mansion was suffocating. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet, the kind that brought solace, no. This was the kind of silence that gnawed at a man's sanity, stretching the hours into something unbearable. For years, Michael had surrounded himself with people, business partners, acquaintances, beautiful women, anyone who could serve a purpose in his life. But now, as he sat in his massive living room, the echoes of his own breathing the only company he had, he realized the brutal truth. He was alone, utterly, completely alone. The first few days back home after his stroke were miserable. Michael had always prided himself on self-sufficiency, on never needing anyone. But now even the simplest tasks had become a challenge. He struggled to button his shirt with only one functioning hand. Writing his signature, once a precise, effortless motion, was now an exercise in frustration. Even pouring himself a damn glass of water was a humiliating process, and the worst part, there was no one to help him. He had no live-in staff. He had dismissed them months ago, back when he thought he didn't need anyone. His assistant, Marissa, had quit while he was in the hospital. He hadn't bothered to replace her. The friends he used to drink with, the women who used to flock to him, they had vanished the moment he became a liability. The calls had stopped. The messages dried up. Michael Donovan, the man who once commanded rooms with his presence, was now invisible. Days passed in a blur of frustration and self-pity. He tried to return to work, only to find that his own company had started to move on without him. Alan had taken over major projects. The board had held emergency meetings in his absence, and worst of all, his name, once feared in the industry, was now whispered with pity. "He's not the same," one executive had murmured when Michael showed up at a board meeting. "Lost his edge." Another said, "The stroke changed him." Michael had clenched his jaw and left without a word. It didn't matter. He still had his home, his wealth, even if it all felt empty. One evening, as he sat in the dimly lit living room, the walls pressing in on him, he reached for his phone. He wasn't even sure why. Maybe he just wanted to hear a voice that wasn't coming from the TV, maybe, for the first time in years. He wanted to talk to someone who actually cared. His fingers hovered over Emily's name. He hesitated. She hadn't called, not once. Why would she? He had pushed her away when she needed him the most. He had thrown her aside like she meant nothing. Michael swallowed, his throat tight. He knew calling her would be selfish. She was happy now, she had healed, and yet, before he could second-guess himself, he pressed the call button. It rang. Once, twice, then, click. His breath caught in his throat. "Michael," Emily's voice, soft, cautious, familiar. For a moment he couldn't speak. His tongue felt heavy, his mind sluggish. He had rehearsed what he would say. Something smooth, something detached, but now, faced with her voice, all those words evaporated. "Michael," she repeated, confusion in her tone. He swallowed hard. "Hey." Silence. Then a quiet sigh. "Why are you calling?" 100 answers ran through his mind, but none of them felt right. He exhaled shakily. "I don't know." More silence then, softer this time. "Are you okay?" Michael closed his eyes. For years, he had been the strong one, the powerful one. He had never allowed himself to admit weakness. But now, sitting alone in a house that felt more like a prison, with a body that no longer obeyed him, and a life that had crumbled at his feet. No, he wasn't okay, not even close, but he couldn't say that. Instead, he forced out a dry chuckle. "I'm fine." Emily didn't respond immediately, and then, "You don't sound fine." Michael's grip tightened on the phone. She still knew him, even after everything. She still knew when he was lying, and that hurt more than anything. "You don't have to pretend with me," she said gently. Something cracked inside him, but before he could respond, another voice, faint in the background, called Emily's name. A man's voice. Michael froze. Emily hesitated, as if she knew what he had just heard. "Michael, I have to go." His pulse pounded in his ears. "Who was that?" She sighed. "It doesn't matter." "It does to me." His voice came out sharper than he intended. Emily was quiet for a long moment, then, "You lost the right to ask that." "Michael." His stomach twisted. He wanted to argue, to demand answers, to remind her that once she had been his. But she was right. He had lost that right, and there was nothing he could do about it. "Take care of yourself, Michael," she said softly. Then the line went dead. Michael stared at the phone in his hand. His breathing uneven. He should have expected this, of course. Emily would move on, of course. She would find someone who treated her better, and yet, the realization was like a knife to the gut. She was truly gone. Not just from his house, not just from his life, but from him, and for the first time in his life. Michael Donovan finally understood what it meant to lose something that mattered. Michael Donovan had always believed that time fixed everything. Problems came and went. Fortunes were lost and regained. People left and were replaced. That was the nature of life, but as the days stretched into weeks, he realized that this wasn't one of those problems. Emily wasn't coming back, and no amount of waiting, no amount of pretending was going to change that. The morning air was cold as Michael stepped out onto his balcony, gripping the railing for support. His right hand still trembled slightly, a lingering reminder of his stroke. He hated this weakness, hated the way his body refused to obey him, hated the way people looked at him now, pitying, hesitant, as if he were fragile. Most of all, he hated the silence. Emily's absence had left a void in his world, one that he had spent the last month trying to ignore. But no matter how much he drank, no matter how many distractions he chased, the truth remained. He had built this emptiness himself, and now he had to live in it. His company was barely holding together. Alan had managed to keep things running in his absence, but the cracks were showing. Clients were pulling out, investors were hesitant, and Michael, he was no longer the man they trusted. At first, he tried to force his way back in. He scheduled meetings, made calls, tried to assure everyone that he was still the same Michael Donovan, but he wasn't. The moment he walked into the boardroom, he felt it, the shift, the unease. The way his employees avoided his eyes, the way they exchanged glances when he spoke, as if silently questioning whether he was still capable of leading. Alan had pulled him aside afterward. "Michael, you have to step back." Michael clenched his jaw. "I'm fine," Alan sighed. "No, you're not. Look, I've been trying to hold things together, but the truth is, the board is considering pushing you out." Michael stiffened. "They wouldn't dare." Alan hesitated. "A year ago, no. But now investors are nervous. You haven't been the same since the stroke. They're worried about stability." Michael's stomach twisted. "They want you to step down," Alan continued. "Temporarily, at least. Let them see that the company can function without chaos for a while." Michael's fingers dug into the armrest of his chair. "If I step down, they'll never let me back in." Alan didn't argue, because they both knew it was true. That night, Michael sat in his study, a glass of whiskey untouched on the table beside him. He had spent his entire life clawing his way to the top. Every decision he had made, every risk he had taken, had been for this: power, success, control. And now, he was losing all of it, piece by piece. He had lost Emily, he had lost the respect of his employees, and soon he would lose the company he had built with his own two hands. A bitter laugh escaped him. For years he had looked down on Emily's weakness, and yet here he was, broken. The irony was almost laughable. 2 days later, Alan arranged a meeting with the board. Michael knew what was coming. The men who had once hung onto his every word now watched him with careful expressions, choosing their words delicately. "We respect everything you've done for this company, Michael," one of them said, folding his hands on the table. "But we have to think about the future." Michael sat rigidly in his chair. "And you think I'm not part of that future?" The silence that followed told him everything he needed to know. Alan cleared his throat. "Michael, stepping back doesn't mean stepping away. This is about stability, about showing investors that the company is still strong." Michael's hands clenched into fists. He had built this company, he had sacrificed everything for it, and now they were throwing him aside. "Fine," he said tightly. "You want me gone, I'll step back, but don't expect me to sit quietly while you dismantle everything I worked for." The board members exchanged glances but didn't argue, because the truth was, they didn't need him anymore. Michael stood, shoving his chair back. His right leg trembled slightly as he walked out of the room, but he forced himself not to falter. Not here, not in front of them. That evening, he sat alone in his house, the divorce papers still untouched on his desk. For the first time, he had no distractions, no company, no work, no obligations, just himself and the weight of everything he had lost. A man like Michael Donovan wasn't meant to be powerless, but here he was, stripped of everything that had once made him feel invincible, and for the first time he had to ask himself, who was he without any of it? Michael Donovan hadn't been out in weeks after stepping back from his company. No, being forced to step back, he had barely left the house. The once pristine mansion had started to feel suffocating, the silence weighing on him more each day. He had lost count of how many nights he had stared at the untouched divorce papers on his desk, his mind replaying every decision that had led him to this moment. He told himself he didn't care, that none of it mattered, but that was a lie, and tonight, for the first time in weeks, he needed to get out. The restaurant was a familiar one, an upscale place he and Emily used to frequent when they were younger, before success had consumed him. Back then, they had dined here in celebration of small victories, landing a client, paying off a loan, surviving another month in the brutal world of business. Now, as Michael stepped inside, he wasn't sure why he had chosen this place. Maybe he just wanted a reminder of who he used to be. Before everything unraveled, the hostess greeted him with a polite smile. "Table for one, Mr. Donovan." The words stung more than they should have. "Yes," he said, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve, a habit despite the weakness in his right hand. She led him toward the back, past tables filled with laughter and conversation, past couples leaning in close to whisper to one another. He ignored them, or at least he tried to. Then, just as he was about to sit, a familiar voice froze him in place. Soft, warm, hers. Michael's pulse quickened. He turned slightly, heart hammering against his ribs. Emily, she was sitting at a table near the window, laughing at something, and she wasn't alone. A man sat across from her. He was well-dressed, about Michael's age, with an easy smile and a presence that made Michael's stomach tighten. His mind struggled to process it. Emily had moved on. It wasn't just a possibility anymore, it was real. Michael clenched his jaw and forced himself to move. He lowered himself into his seat, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling in his chest. But his eyes betrayed him. They kept drifting back to her. She looked different. Not in a drastic way, but in the way she held herself. There was a lightness to her that he hadn't seen in years, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. He had expected to feel anger, resentment, jealousy. Instead, all he felt was a deep, aching regret. Minutes passed. He wasn't even sure if he had ordered anything. His mind was too preoccupied with the sight of Emily smiling in a way she hadn't with him in years. Then, before he could stop himself, he did something reckless. He stood and walked straight to her table. Emily looked up, and for a moment, surprise flickered across her face. "Michael!" Her companion turned as well, watching with curiosity. Michael forced a smirk, even though his heart was pounding. "Didn't expect to see you here." Emily studied him for a long moment. If she was caught off guard, she hid it well. "You look well," she said. Though her voice held something unreadable, Michael let out a humorless chuckle. "I'd say the same, but clearly you look better without me." She frowned slightly. "Michael, I don't mean that as an insult," he cut in, lifting a hand before she could protest. "Just an observation." Emily exhaled softly, then gestured to the man across from her. "This is Daniel." Daniel extended a hand, and for a second Michael hesitated. His right hand still wasn't as strong as it used to be, but he wasn't going to let that show. He shook Daniel's hand, firm despite the tremor. "Michael Donovan," he said, as if the man didn't already know. Daniel simply nodded. "Nice to meet you." Michael let his gaze shift back to Emily. "Can we talk?" A flicker of hesitation crossed her features. "Michael, I don't know if... just for a minute," he said. "Please." That one word seemed to catch her off guard. He hadn't said please to her in years. Finally, she sighed. "Daniel, would you mind?" Daniel, to his credit, didn't look annoyed. He simply gave Emily a small smile. "Take your time." Michael watched him go, resisting the urge to analyze every little thing about him. When they were alone, he exhaled. "So you're seeing someone?" Emily folded her arms, tilting her head slightly. "Is that why you wanted to talk, to confirm what you already knew?" Michael ran a hand over his face. "No, yes, I don't know." He let out a breath. I didn't think I'd see you here." She studied him carefully. "Michael, why are you here?" The question should have been simple, but it wasn't. He could have said he was just getting dinner. He could have said it was a coincidence, but instead, the truth slipped out before he could stop it. "I don't know who I am without you." Silence. Emily's lips parted slightly, her eyes searching his, but she didn't say anything right away. Michael let out a dry laugh. "Pathetic, huh? I spent years convincing myself I didn't need anyone, that I didn't need you." His voice softened. "Turns out I was wrong." Emily sighed, looking down at her hands. "Michael, I don't know what you expect me to say." He swallowed. "I don't expect anything. I needed to say it." Another long pause, then quietly, "I loved you," she said. "I really did." The past tense felt like a punch to the gut. "But I'm happy now," she continued, "and I need you to let me be." Michael closed his eyes for a brief second before nodding. "Okay," he murmured, "I hear you." Emily studied him for a moment longer. Then, with one last small bittersweet smile, she stood. "Goodbye, Michael." And just like that, she walked away. Michael sat there for a long time, watching the space she had just occupied. He had gotten his answer. Emily had moved on, and now, for the first time, he had to figure out how to do the same. Michael Donovan had never been good at handling rejection. In business, he refused to take no for an answer. He pushed, negotiated, manipulated circumstances until things bent in his favor. Failure was never an option. But now, as he sat alone in his car outside the restaurant, staring blankly at the dashboard, he realized something. This wasn't business. This was Emily, and she had made her choice. The drive home was quiet, the city lights blurring as he sped through the streets. The mansion loomed ahead like a reminder of everything he had built and everything he had lost when he stepped inside. The silence wrapped around him like a ghost. Emily's voice still echoed in his head. "I loved you, I really did, but I'm happy now and I need you to let me be." Michael poured himself a drink, but for the first time in his life, the alcohol didn't bring relief. Nothing did. Days passed, then a week. He avoided calls, ignored emails. The company was no longer his problem. The board had made that clear. And honestly, he didn't have the energy to fight anymore. He was tired, more than that. He was exhausted. Everything that had once driven him, the hunger for power, for control, felt meaningless now. And so, one afternoon, with no real plan in mind, he found himself parked outside a modest, brick-lined building, Silver Oak Medical Center. The place Emily had gone when she left. He hesitated before stepping out of the car, feeling a strange mix of nerves and something else, something close to shame. He had abandoned her when she needed him most, and now here he was seeking something from her. But what? Forgiveness, closure, or just a way to quiet the voice in his head, telling him he had ruined everything? The waiting room smelled like antiseptic and fresh coffee. Michael approached the front desk, clearing his throat. "I'm looking for Dr. Callahan." The receptionist gave him a quick glance before nodding. "One moment." Minutes later, Dr. Callahan stepped out, his gaze unreadable. "Michael Donovan," he said. "Wasn't expecting to see you here." Michael forced a tight smile. "Yeah, didn't think I'd ever be here either." The doctor crossed his arms. "What do you need?" Michael hesitated. "Emily, I need to see her, doctor." Callahan's expression didn't change. "She doesn't work here anymore." Michael blinked. "What?" "She left a few weeks ago," the doctor continued. "Took a new job, moved to a new place. She's doing well." Michael's stomach twisted. "Where did she move?" Dr. Callahan shook his head. "I can't tell you that." Michael clenched his jaw. "I just want to talk to her." "She doesn't owe you that." The words hit harder than he expected. Michael let out a slow breath, running a hand down his face. "I know." His voice was quieter now. "But I need to apologize." The doctor studied him for a long moment before sighing. "She forgave you a long time ago." "Michael." Michael frowned. "What?" Dr. Callahan exhaled. "Emily isn't the type of person to hold on to bitterness. She let go of the anger months ago." Michael swallowed hard. "Then why? Forgiving you doesn't mean she wants you back," the doctor cut in. "It doesn't mean she wants you in her life." The words settled like a weight in Michael's chest. He had been so focused on fixing things, on trying to repair what was broken, that he hadn't considered the possibility that Emily had already made peace with the past. She had forgiven him. She had moved on. And now, he had to do the same. The drive back home was quiet. Michael didn't know how long he sat in his car after pulling into the driveway, staring at the mansion that once held everything he thought he wanted. For years, he had equated success with power, with winning. But now, for the first time, he realized something. He had lost Emily, not because of one mistake, but because of who he had become. She had been willing to fight for him, to stand by him when no one else would, and he had thrown her away. He had been given love, real love, and he had treated it like a burden now, he understood. Forgiveness wasn't about getting a second chance. It was about letting go. And finally, Michael Donovan was ready to do that. Michael Donovan had always believed that the worst pain in life came from failure. Failure in business, failure in maintaining power, failure in securing everything he had worked for. But now, sitting alone in the dimly lit living room of his mansion, he realized he had been wrong. The worst pain wasn't failure. It was regret. And regret had settled in his bones like a sickness. The following week, Michael kept himself busy with routine. He woke up early, went for therapy to regain control of his weakened right side, answered a few business emails, even though the company no longer belonged to him the way it once did. But everything felt pointless. He was going through the motions of a life that no longer felt like his. And then one evening, he received a phone call that changed everything. The number was unfamiliar. Michael hesitated before answering. "Hello?" A brief silence, then a voice, "Rachel." Michael immediately tensed. "Rachel," she exhaled on the other end. "Yeah, it's me." Michael sat up straighter. "Why are you calling?" Rachel was the last person he expected to hear from after Emily left. She had made it very clear she wanted nothing to do with him, and yet here she was. "Look, I wasn't sure if I should call," she admitted. "But there's something you need to know." Michael's pulse quickened. "What is it?" Another pause, then, "It's about Emily." His grip on the phone tightened. "What about her?" Rachel hesitated, and for a second, Michael thought she might hang up, but then she spoke. "Michael, Emily never had a terminal illness. You know that now," she said carefully. He exhaled. Yeah, and I've already paid the price for the way I treated her. You don't have to remind me. I'm not calling to remind you of that, Rachel said. I'm calling because there's something she never told you. Michael's brows furrowed. What are you talking about? Another pause. Then, in a voice so soft it was almost a whisper, Rachel said, She was pregnant, Michael. Michael's entire body went cold. His breath caught in his throat. His fingers gripped the phone so tightly, his knuckles turned white. What? His voice came out hoarse. Rachel sighed. She found out right before she left you. She was too weak to process it at the time, and with the stress of everything happening between you two, she never told you. Michael's mind was spinning. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Emily had been pregnant with his child. His stomach churned. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. Where is she? He demanded, his voice rough. Rachel hesitated. Michael, where is she, Rachel? His tone sharpened. I need to see her now. Rachel sighed. She didn't want you to know. She didn't want to drag you into this. Michael let out a humorless laugh. She didn't want to drag me into this. Rachel, we're talking about my child. I had a right to know. Rachel's voice softened. Maybe, but can you blame her after everything? Michael shut his eyes. No, he couldn't. Because the man Emily had left behind, the man who had abandoned her in her weakest moment, didn't deserve to know, but he wasn't that man anymore. I need to find her, Michael said, his voice quieter now. Rachel sighed. She's not hiding, Michael. She moved on. She built a life for herself and the baby, and you showing up now. Michael clenched his jaw. I don't care if she's moved on. I need to see my child. A long pause. Then, finally, Rachel relented. She's in Boston, she said. She started over there. She's been raising your child alone. Michael's breath hitched. His child, somewhere in Boston. There was a little boy or girl, his flesh and blood, and he had spent the last few years completely unaware of their existence that night. Michael didn't sleep. His mind raced with possibilities. Had Emily told their child about him? Did they even know he existed? What would they think of him? He had always been a man who controlled his own fate. But now, for the first time in his life, he was terrified. Terrified of what he would find in Boston. Terrified of who he had become in his child's absence. But one thing was clear. He wasn't going to run from this, not again tomorrow. He would get on a plane. Tomorrow, he would find Emily. And tomorrow, he would meet the child he never knew he had. Michael Donovan had spent most of his life making calculated decisions. Every move he had ever made was strategic. His business empire, his investments, even the way he chose his words in negotiations. He was a man who planned, a man who controlled outcomes. But now, as he sat in the first-class section of a flight to Boston, his fingers gripping the armrest tightly, he realized something. For the first time in his life, he had no plan, no strategy, no idea what he was walking into. He had a child who had grown up never knowing him, a child Emily had protected from the man he used to be. And now, after all this time, he was about to face the consequences of what he had lost. The flight was short, but it felt like an eternity. Michael barely noticed the luxury around him, the perfectly pressed napkins, the expensive wine, the murmured conversations of businessmen discussing their latest ventures. None of it mattered, not anymore. His mind was consumed with one thought. What if it's too late? What if Emily refused to let him into their child's life? What if the child wanted nothing to do with him? For years, Michael had feared losing control. Now, he feared losing something he had never even known he had. Rachel had given him an address, a quiet neighborhood just outside the city. As the cab pulled up in front of the house, Michael took a deep breath, his heart hammering against his ribs. It was a modest home. Not small, but nowhere near the grand estate he had once shared with Emily. The front yard was well kept, with a wooden swing set tucked under a large oak tree. Michael's throat tightened. There was something painfully intimate about seeing the place where his child was growing up, a life that had nothing to do with him. He stepped out of the cab, his hands slightly unsteady. He had rehearsed what he would say, how he would approach Emily, but now, standing at her doorstep, everything he had prepared felt useless. He took a deep breath and knocked. The door opened. Emily, for a moment, she just stared. Her breath hitched, and Michael saw a flicker of emotions cross her face. Shock, hesitation, something unreadable. Then she composed herself. "You found me," she said quietly. Michael swallowed hard. "Rachel told me." A long silence stretched between them. Then, "What do you want, Michael?" Her voice wasn't cold, but it wasn't welcoming either. Michael exhaled. "To see my child." Emily's fingers tightened around the doorframe. "It took you this long." His jaw tensed. "I didn't know." Her eyes softened slightly, but there was still a guarded edge to her. "And now that you do," Michael ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly, "I don't expect anything from you, Emily. I need to meet them." Emily studied him for a long moment. Then, finally, she stepped aside. "Come in." The house was warm. Inviting. It wasn't filled with luxury, but it was full of life. Photographs lined the walls, pictures of Emily, of Rachel, and of a little girl with big brown eyes and dark curls. Michael's chest tightened as he stared at the images. His daughter, he had missed everything, her first steps, her first words, her birthdays. Emily must have noticed his expression because she sighed softly. "Her name is Lily." Lily. Michael repeated the name in his head, letting it settle. A name he should have known, a name he should have spoken 1,000 times by now. "She's 6, Emily continued, watching him carefully. "And she doesn't know about you." Michael looked at her sharply. "You never told her." Emily folded her arms. "How could I? You were gone, Michael. I wasn't going to tell her about a father who wasn't there." He swallowed hard. "I'm here now." Emily hesitated, then, finally. She nodded toward the backyard. "She's outside." Michael stepped onto the porch, his breath catching in his throat. Lily was sitting on the swing, humming to herself as she kicked her feet. She had Emily's smile. His chest ached. He had never been this nervous in his life, as if sensing him. Lily turned her head. Her big brown eyes met his for a second. Neither of them moved. Then she tilted her head. "Who are you?" Michael's throat went dry. How was he supposed to answer that? Emily stepped forward, kneeling beside her. "Sweetheart, this is Michael." Lily blinked. "Like Uncle Michael." Emily smiled gently. "No, honey, this is your dad." Michael felt the air leave his lungs. Lily stared at him, her small face unreadable. Then, finally, "You're my daddy." The word hit him like a punch to the gut. He swallowed, his voice hoarse. "Yeah, Lily, I am." She frowned slightly, as if trying to make sense of it. "Where have you been?" Michael felt his chest tighten. This was it, the question he had dreaded. He crouched down slowly, meeting her gaze. "I made mistakes," he admitted. "I wasn't there when I should have been, and I'm so sorry for that." Lily studied him, her little brows furrowing. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. "Are you going to leave again?" Michael's heart cracked. "No," he whispered. "Never again." Lily stared at him for a moment longer. Then, slowly, hesitantly, she reached out and touched his hand. It was small, warm, and for the first time in years, Michael felt whole. Tears burned his eyes. But he didn't let them fall, because in this moment, in this tiny, fragile moment, he had been given something he never thought he would have again. A second chance. Michael Donovan had never been afraid of challenges. He had faced ruthless competitors, impossible deals, and high-stakes negotiations that could make or break his empire. He had stood in boardrooms with men who would tear him apart at the first sign of weakness, and he had always come out on top. But now, as he sat on the wooden porch of Emily's house, watching his daughter play in the backyard, he realized something. This was the hardest thing he had ever done. Because this wasn't about winning. This wasn't about power. This was about earning something real, and he had no idea how to do it. Lily had been cautious at first. After their brief introduction, she had returned to her swing set, occasionally stealing glances at him when she thought he wasn't looking. She hadn't spoken much. Michael hadn't pushed. Instead, he sat there watching, waiting. Emily had come outside after a while, leaning against the railing. "She's confused," she said softly. "This is a lot for her to take in." Michael nodded, his throat tight. "I don't want to scare her." "You won't," Emily assured him. Then, after a moment, she added, "But this isn't going to be easy, Michael. You can't just show up and expect her to love you." Michael swallowed hard. "I know." Emily studied him carefully, as if trying to gauge whether he truly meant it. Then, finally, "You can stay for dinner." The inside of the house felt warm. Lived in. It smelled like home-cooked food, something comforting and familiar, something Michael hadn't felt in years. Emily moved around the kitchen with practiced ease, preparing dinner, while Lily set the table with small, careful movements. Michael stood awkwardly at the edge of the room, unsure of where he fit in. Then, "Can you help me?" Michael turned, surprised to find Lily standing beside him, holding a stack of napkins. Her eyes were hesitant but curious, as if testing the waters. His heart ached. "Yeah," he said, taking the napkins. "Of course." Together, they placed them next to the plates, Lily watching him carefully as if trying to memorize his movements. It was small, but to Michael, it felt like everything. Dinner was quiet at first. Michael didn't know what to say, and Lily was still watching him like he was some sort of puzzle she hadn't figured out yet. Emily, ever patient, guided the conversation, talking about school, work, the little things in life that made up their world. Michael listened, absorbing every detail. Lily liked drawing. She loved animals. Her favorite color was blue. She was learning to ride a bike, but still needed training wheels. He memorized every word. Then, as she twirled her spaghetti with her fork, Lily finally broke the silence. "Do you live far away?" she asked. Looking up at him, Michael set his glass down carefully. "Yeah," he admitted. "I live in New York." Lily frowned. "That's far." "It is," Michael agreed. "But I can come visit." Lily considered this. "A lot." Michael's throat tightened. "As much as you want," he promised. Lily nodded slowly, as if she was still deciding what to think of him. But for the first time that night, she smiled, and it nearly broke him. After dinner, Lily disappeared into her room, and Michael found himself alone with Emily in the dimly lit kitchen. "She likes you," Emily said softly. Michael exhaled. "She doesn't know me." Emily nodded. "But she wants to." Michael rubbed his hands together. A nervous habit he hadn't done in years. "I don't know how to do this, Em." Emily studied him for a long moment. "Just show up for her, Michael. Be the father she deserves. That's all you need to do." Michael swallowed hard. "And you?" Emily sighed, crossing her arms. "I forgave you, Michael, but that doesn't mean we can go back to the way things were." He nodded slowly, forcing himself to accept it. "I understand," she hesitated. "Do you?" Michael met her gaze. "I do. I don't know how to let go of everything I ruined." Emily's expression softened slightly. "You don't have to fix the past, Michael. You just have to be better now." Michael nodded, letting her words settle. He had lost Emily, but he still had a chance with Lily, and for the first time, he knew exactly what he had to do. He wasn't going to run. He wasn't going to disappear. He was going to be a father. No matter how long it took to earn that title, Michael Donovan had always believed that people were replaceable. In business, if an employee left, another would take their place. If a deal fell through, a new opportunity would emerge. Nothing was ever permanent. But now, as he sat in his hotel room in Boston, staring at the ceiling in the dim glow of the bedside lamp, he realized something terrifying. He had been replaced. Not by another businessman, not by a competitor, by time, by life moving on without him. The past few days had been a blur. Since that first dinner at Emily's house, he had spent more time with Lily. Small moments like walking her to school, listening to her stories, watching as she sketched pictures at the kitchen table. She was hesitant around him, but curious. She didn't ask deep questions, didn't demand explanations about where he had been all these years. She simply accepted his presence in the innocent way that only a child could, and that somehow made it worse, because she had learned to live without him. She had grown up without needing him, and while Michael was desperate to be part of her world now, he couldn't ignore the truth. That world had never included him before, and maybe it didn't need to. One afternoon, while Emily was out running errands, Michael found himself sitting with Lily in the living room. She was coloring, her little hands moving carefully as she filled the page with soft blues and yellows. Michael sat across from her, watching. She looked up, catching his gaze. "What?" Michael blinked. "Nothing." She tilted her head. "You're staring." A small smirk tugged at his lips. "Sorry." She hesitated before speaking again. "Are you leaving soon?" Michael's chest tightened. "Do you want me to?" Lily considered this. "I don't know." Michael swallowed hard. "I don't want to leave." Lily's small fingers gripped the crayon a little tighter. "But you live far away." "Yeah." "And Mommy says your job is important." Michael exhaled. "It used to be." Lily frowned. "Not anymore." Michael hesitated, then softly, "You're more important." Lily blinked, and then, after a long moment, she smiled. Michael's heart clenched. He had spent years chasing things that didn't matter, and now all he wanted was this: to sit at a tiny table with his daughter, watching her color, listening to her talk. That evening, after Lily had gone to bed, Michael lingered in the kitchen. Emily leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "She likes having you here." Michael nodded. "I like being here." Emily studied him. "So what happens next?" Michael ran a hand down his face. "I don't know. You can't just visit once and disappear again, Michael." "I know," Emily exhaled. "She deserves consistency, stability." Michael's jaw tightened. "I can be that for her." Emily hesitated. "Can you?" Michael looked up, meeting her gaze. "I'm willing to try." Emily studied him for a long moment. Then finally she nodded. "Then start small, stay for a little longer, let her get used to you." Michael swallowed hard. "And you?" Emily sighed. "I'm happy, Michael, but I don't hate you. I want you to have a relationship with her, but I need to know you won't walk away this time." Michael clenched his fists. "I won't," Emily nodded. "Then prove it." And for the first time, Michael knew that he would. No more running, no more disappearing. He wasn't just going to be Lily's father in name, he was going to earn it. Michael Donovan had never been a patient man. In business, he thrived on instant results. Quick negotiations. Fast deals. Immediate success. Waiting was a waste of time. But when it came to his daughter, patience was all he had. Days turned into a week turned into 2, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, Lily began to let him in. It started with small things. She asked him to push her on the swing in the backyard. She showed him her drawings, waiting to see if he liked them before flashing a proud smile. She let him braid her doll's hair, badly, but she giggled anyway. She called him Michael at first. Then, one night, when he tucked her into bed while Emily was working late, she mumbled sleepily, "Good night." "Daddy?" Michael sat frozen in her doorway long after she had fallen asleep. He had spent his entire life believing that money, power, and respect were the most valuable things a man could possess. But nothing, not his company, not his fortune, not his influence, had ever felt as important as that single word. One afternoon, he picked her up from school. It was the first time he had ever done it, and as he stood outside the building, surrounded by other parents, he felt out of place. Lily came running out with her backpack bouncing on her shoulders, her eyes lighting up when she spotted him. "Michael." He crouched slightly, bracing himself as she ran straight into him. The hug was quick, almost shy, but it was real. His throat tightened as he ruffled her curls. "Hey, kiddo, how was school?" Lily shrugged. "Good. We had art class. I made something." She pulled out a crumpled piece of paper from her backpack, unfolding it carefully. It was a drawing of them, a simple picture. Her, Emily, and him standing in front of the house. Michael stared at it, his chest tightening. "You put me in the picture?" he asked, his voice quieter than he intended. Lily looked up at him. "Yeah, 'cause you're here now." Michael inhaled sharply. He wasn't going to cry. Not here, not now, but God. He had never felt something so important in his entire life. That evening, after Lily had gone to bed, he found Emily in the kitchen, washing dishes. She glanced at him as he leaned against the counter. "She's getting attached to you," Emily said softly. Michael nodded. "I know." Emily dried her hands with a dish towel. "And what happens when you leave?" Michael exhaled. "I'm not leaving." Emily folded her arms. "Michael, your life is in New York, your company, your entire world." Michael hesitated. The old him would have never considered walking away from his empire. But what was that world without Lily, without this? "I'll figure it out," he said finally. "I can move part of my business here or fly back and forth." Emily sighed. "That's not enough. She needs consistency, not a part-time father who visits when it's convenient." Michael swallowed hard. "Then tell me what to do." "Emily, because I don't want to be some distant figure in her life. I want to be her father." Emily studied him for a long moment. Then softly, "Then stay." Michael stilled. "Not here," Emily clarified quickly. "Not with me, but stay in Boston. Get a place nearby, build a life that includes her." Michael exhaled. "Would you be okay with that?" Emily hesitated. I think it would be good for her and for you." Michael let out a slow breath. For the first time, he wasn't chasing a business deal. He wasn't fighting for power. He was choosing something real. and for once it felt like the right choice. A week later, Michael signed the lease for a house just 10 minutes away. It wasn't a mansion, it wasn't extravagant, but it was enough. Enough to build something new, something that mattered. The first time Lily saw the house, she blinked up at him. "You're staying?" she asked, her small hands gripping the strap of her backpack. Michael knelt to her level, meeting her eyes. "Yeah, kiddo, I'm staying." Lily stared at him for a long moment, as if making sure he wasn't lying. Then, slowly, hesitantly, she wrapped her arms around his neck. Michael's throat tightened as he hugged her back, his arms wrapping securely around his daughter. For the first time in his life, he felt something he had never truly known before: home. Michael Donovan never thought he would find peace in something so simple, not in the skyscrapers of New York, not in million-dollar contracts or high-stakes board meetings, but here, standing in the backyard of his new home, watching Lily chase fireflies in the fading golden light, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Contentment, not the kind that came from success or power, but the kind that came from choosing the right thing, and for once, he had. Adjusting to life in Boston had been an adjustment, but not as difficult as he had expected. He had cut ties with Donovan Enterprises, not entirely, but enough to let go of the suffocating control that had once defined him. Alan had taken over the company, and while it had stung to hand over the reins, Michael had realized something. The company would survive without him, but his daughter wouldn't. So he stayed. He built a new life, a quieter one, a better one, one that mattered. Lily adjusted quickly to having him around. At first, she had treated his presence as temporary, as if expecting him to disappear. But the weeks passed, then the months, and he didn't leave. He picked her up from school, helped her with her homework, took her out for ice cream on weekends. He showed up, and that made all the difference. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sky darken, Lily turned to him. "Did you ever miss me?" she asked. Michael felt his chest tighten. He had spent so many years believing he didn't need anyone. That love was a weakness. But now, as he looked into his daughter's wide, questioning eyes, he saw the truth. He had been missing her long before he even knew she existed. "More than anything," he whispered. Lily nodded, as if she somehow understood. And that was enough. Emily had softened toward him, softened. They weren't together, and Michael had accepted that, but they had learned how to coexist, to be parents, to build something stable for Lily. There were no screaming arguments, no bitterness, just understanding. One night, as he dropped Lily off, Emily lingered in the doorway. "You're doing a good job," she said. Almost hesitantly, Michael exhaled. "I'm trying." She studied him for a long moment, then, "I think she's happy." Michael looked over at Lily, who was curled up on the couch with a book, humming softly to herself. And for the first time, he allowed himself to believe it. She was happy, and so was he. Months passed, and Michael learned that being a father wasn't about grand gestures. It was about the little things: helping Lily tie her shoes, watching her dance in the living room, listening to her stories about school. It was about showing up, not just once, but always. One afternoon, while Lily was playing in the yard, Michael sat across from Emily at the kitchen table. There was no tension between them anymore, just quiet understanding. Emily stirred her coffee, glancing up at him. "Do you ever miss it?" Michael raised an eyebrow. "Miss what?" "Your old life," she said. "The company, the power?" Michael thought about it. The truth was, he had spent so many years chasing the wrong things, and now he had everything that actually mattered. So he shook his head. "No, I don't." Emily smiled softly. "Good." And for the first time in his life, Michael Donovan didn't feel like he had lost. He felt like he had finally won. Because he had found something far more valuable than power. He had found himself, and that was enough. One evening, as he tucked Lily into bed, she looked up at him sleepily. "Are you going to stay forever?" she mumbled, her voice thick with drowsiness. Michael's throat tightened. He brushed a strand of hair from her face, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. "Yeah, kiddo," he whispered. "I'm staying forever." Lily sighed contentedly, curling up beneath the blankets, and as Michael sat there, watching his daughter drift to sleep, he realized something. He had spent his whole life chasing the wrong kind of success. But this was his greatest victory, and he wouldn't trade it for anything.